Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is episode 18 with my guest, Father Patrick, to talk again for part 2 of an Orthodox perspective on papal primacy and ecclesiology. So Father, welcome back. It's great to have you back on.
Thank you, it's great to be back on.
Yeah, so for this episode, what I want to do is go over your interaction with Roman Catholic and Orthodox ecclesiologists and theologians, see how much we can cover, kind of going the opposite way we did in the first episode, focusing more on your thesis of theodic relationships. Now I'm just going back more into the nitty-gritties of your interactions with the ecclesiological literature review. So for my first question for you, Father, is your interaction with Cardinal Avery Dulles. He has, you talk about church as community of disciples. So let me ask, why did you choose to interact with him, and what does the Cardinal mean by that?
Right, I chose to interact with him because he set up a I wanted to present the thesis as a sort of a model or a perspective on how the church is organized, the way we can sort of frame our understanding of the church's way of existing and our relationships within it. So he provided a useful sort of summary of some of the chief ideas which people talk about in the sense of a mission, or I think he had 5 or 6 different ways, and disciples was one of them. So I used that as a sort of a general framework for the thesis, and then I took the view which the theodic relations which I did develop, and then used the thesis to sort of say, it addresses some of the issues that each point tries to cover. So for mission, or whether it's discipleship, or it's a Eucharist, all these different things, or communion, is trying to say, it actually meets why the people chose that as a way of describing the church. It satisfies those conditions. So that was just a useful way of putting it into the framework of material that had gone before. And Cardinal Joseph book was probably one of the most useful ones in doing that. And discipleship, it was important. Well, again, for theodic relations, I think it's one of the closest ones. It's the emphasis is on our relationships which we have in the church, whether it be with the bishop, or whether it be with presbyters, or whether it be husband and wives, monks and abbots, and things like that. And those relationships are essentially discipleship relationships, whereas one is sort of in the place of Christ, and the other one follows in a certain level of obedience and listens, and one's a teacher and the other one is sort of a learner, sort of thing. So that's the sort of general structure of theodic relations, and then that fits with discipleship quite well.
Gotcha. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And so overall, would you say that it was more of a positive sort of synthesis of what he was doing, but then carrying it on more than, because I know there will be other criticisms in the book. So would you say, would that be a fair, I guess, analysis or summary?
Yeah, it's not criticizing him per se. It's just sort of taking each of the things which he presented, and then sort of showing the pros and cons of each one, and where each one is useful and where each one is limited, and trying to see if I can find something which is a little bit more comprehensive, I suppose, as I said, to address all the points raised by each.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Father. And the next question I have for you is, so you go on to talk about presence and representation, J.W.C. Wand and Carl Adam on pages 23 through 24. It was interesting because I was about to say I read Carl Adam's work, The Spirit of Catholicism, a long time ago when I was still a Protestant, actually. So it was interesting to see his name come up in this book. I was like, oh, wow, that's a blast from the past. But what do they mean by presence and representation, and why did you choose to interact with them, and how does your thesis interact with them, basically?
I chose to interact because they were bringing an idea of presence, almost like an iconic thing, but that somehow Christ is present in the presbyter or the priest, and the bishop. And so this was a very important part of my thesis, is where I understand the relationships of Christ is truly present in them, such that when you kiss the hand of the presbyter, for example, you're kissing the hand of Christ. When the bishop serves at the liturgy, or the priest serves at the liturgy, Christ is there, present with the priest, serving the liturgy. When the wife obeys her husband, she's obeying Christ. There's very much a real sense of Christ's presence being there. Or a monk obeys his abbot, and the abbot gives a command. It's the commandment of Christ. And these guys set sort of an idea that is around, so I'm not just pulling this out of the hat and saying, hey, look, these other guys are talking about this idea, and I'm building on it. I'm saying, yeah, this is really useful. Let's just build on it and complete it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I definitely like that method, and it's really interesting to see. You see it in all sorts of other fields as well, but I definitely like your constructing case as you go throughout your work. So thank you for that, Father. I appreciate that. Now, this one is really piqued my interest, because you talk about universal church and communion in Joseph Ratzinger, when he was then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, now, of course, Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, from pages 25 through 28. So what is the universal church and communion ecclesiology of Ratzinger, and how do you interact with that, and what's your Orthodox perspective on him in general?
Right, this is having to dig my memory out a little bit more on this one.
That's sure.
Yeah, actually, if you can pull some bits, I don't want to misrepresent it, because I went through it a lot, but because I've got other ideas about universal ecclesiology now, and I don't want to get them confused.
Right, and let me. I think a good thing to do is read maybe the first paragraph or so. So you write on page 25, quote, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, is the best exponent on universal church ecclesiology, particularly that centered on the Pope or the See of St. Peter. Ratzinger is also, to a large extent, a Eucharistic ecclesiologist, although he prefers to refer to communion ecclesiology. His thought will be examined here to establish one primary school of thought based on the place of St. Peter. In a letter which was approved by the late Pope John Paul II and written in 1992 as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Ratzinger proposed a church model based on what he called the mystery of communion. He argues that there is not enough importance given to the relationship between the church as communion and the church as sacrament. And I can continue on if you want, but...
Right. Yes. Now, I think he does emphasize the place of the papacy at the top, and that each local church shouldn't be considered as an end in itself, that the local church has its space in the broader church. And I think he does a pretty good job for it. I think for me, I'll just talk a bit more generally about the universal church as such, because I think this is an important point, which and his work sort of expresses it, but I'm not saying that this is necessarily exactly an expression of his views, so because I'd have to sort of restudy it for about 10 minutes and just get my head around it again. So please forgive me. I can't answer that.
No problem.
Yeah, so my bigger point is that yes, he's got this idea of everyone's in communion together, and the particular places find their place in communion with the central See of Peter. My problem with the other expressions of it, or something as it's expressed in Vatican I, as I think there is a model of the universal church as one organization as church on earth, with the head as being the Bishop of Rome. And what I would argue is that the particular churches are each completely church in itself. There is no such thing as the universal church as a singular institution on earth as such. The church incorporates all the body of Christ, the saints, the departed and living. And on earth, each local church is a complete manifestation of the church in each place. So the bishop is Christ there, the apostles of the presbyters are the apostles. So the whole organization founded on Peter and the apostles, on the rock, on Christ and the apostles, is represented in each place. And so there's no sort of singular organization. But these churches, as agreed, cannot exist by themselves in isolation. They need to exist in communion with each other. And so there is an interrelation where each region is gathered around a metropolitan see, who is a singular point of consecrating all the bishops. Then they're gathered around patriarchs, who are again a singular point for ordaining the metropolitans, and in a single court of appeal for the group, the area under their jurisdiction. And Rome did play an important role in centralizing these churches, and so it was a first, and it was a sort of center of communion. So where I would disagree, I fully accept that, and I think it's an important place, and this is about Peter as the center of communion, but the center of communion of equals. But nevertheless, having first place, but each is the same as himself, but he's singled out as sort of to lead them. And I think this is important to keep this in mind, that there are different roles or ranks, but as bishop, each one is the same. And this is where even the Bishop of Rome, even though he's a center, he cannot act as bishop within the other local territories. Each one bishop is the only bishop in his territory. He acts above each bishop, above each metropolitan actually, and it's a sort of final court of appeal. But he has an oversight of all the churches, writing letters here, there, and saying, "Oh, what are you guys doing? You're not following the tradition." He has first place at the councils to express the faith, etc. He is the most great witness. I mean, most churches will follow the Pope. Well, in the West, they all followed the liturgical practices of Rome. In the East, they followed New Rome. So it has a very important role, and I much draw that from Ratzinger. But just where it sort of merges that somehow there's the church goes into one body around one synod of bishops around the Pope. You see that the Pope with the magisterium of the bishops. This is not, to me, the history of the church. There's many metropolitan sees, each is a synod in that self. That does most of the bishop ordinations and stuff. Then you've got patriarchs that sort of oversee the metropolitans, and the Pope or the Bishop of Rome had even greater oversight over all of that. But certain limits. He didn't go in and ordain all the bishops, for example. That was done for each metropolitan. He didn't go around and ordaining clergy, etc. in each place. That's the role of the local bishop. The metropolitan is his role to ordain local bishops. It's not anyone else's role to interfere with that. And so, yeah, so this is where the model differences, but it's the idea of this universal church that somehow there's one organization, one head across all the earth. And that's where I think, I'm not sure how much he expresses that exactly, but I know that's definitely Vatican I sort of idea, and it is quite a common Roman Catholic idea. And how much he says that directly, I'm not sure. But otherwise, apart from where it's sort of that idea comes out, there's a lot I support what he wrote, and he does reflect quite well on a lot of older traditions.
Yeah, thank you, Father. I appreciate that. One follow-up I had was, because I know from reading other secondary works on ecclesiology, interacting with Ratzinger, and citing from him, I need to actually finally read his work, Call to Communion on ecclesiology. But from what I gather and understand, many post-Vatican II theologians, and even a little bit prior Roman Catholic theologians, and including Ratzinger himself, used the phrase, other than not just universal church, but also particular churches, to refer to local churches. Do you find that problematic in the sense of, basically you're saying that sort of divides up the church? Because I've heard a similar criticism from other Orthodox, where as you say, and Ratzinger does, is a Eucharistic ecclesiologist, but some have found the phrase particular churches to be problematic in terms of like the logical conclusion might be dividing up the church. Would you agree with that or disagree with that, of the phrase particular churches?
I think it's symptomatic of the idea of there being one sort of universal church organization with the Pope at the head. And then it's manifest in these particular churches, each sort of manifests it as far as they're inside of this one organization. And so I think that is a symptom of that. And the word sort of works towards that sort of model, rather than seeing each local diocese as a complete church in itself. Now, sometimes Orthodox are getting a little bit lost on this as well. And when we talk about local church, it has a sort of multiple levels of meaning. Quite often Orthodox will talk about a patriarchate as a sort of a singular organization, and it loses sight that actually, no, it's each bishop. His diocese is the fullness of a church. The patriarchs are there to unite them together in regional areas, but there's not the church by this with one sort of body with here, and you do get this problem. So yeah, I think there is a problematic when you talk about particular churches, because it does assume that there's some sort of universal institution that's sort of above or beyond or transcends the local church. And for me, that's not right. Each local church, the fullness of a church is present in each place, though each place cannot operate or exist independent of the other church. It must be in part of a synod, and these must all be linked together for the unity of the churches. Otherwise, you'd be fragmented into a million different groups, which would be no good. So we need this hierarchical structure, the family structure as such, the one patriarch that just looks after, or actually 2 or 3 patriarchs is my thing, a truncated top to protect it from one man leading the whole thing astray.
Gotcha. Thank you, Father. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And would you say there's any sense in which Orthodox could refer to the Orthodox Church as the communion of churches as the universal church, or just stick to basically what you said there? Because the reason I ask that is because many people, and I know there's different debates about this, and we'll get into this also further on too in your work, but different, preferences in the Church Fathers talk about either the Catholic faith, the Orthodox faith, things like this, what we have received from the apostles, and there does seem to be a sense of some universality. So would you say that the Orthodox Church is the universal church in any sense, or that's still more Roman Catholic and problematic?
It depends exactly how one's defining terms.
Right.
We can talk about the church universal in the sense, and in a world, essentially all the churches are across the world. And so there is a sense with that as a legitimate way of speaking. But yeah, I think there is some problematic to it. And so I wouldn't write it off and say, no, you cannot speak like that. But I think people have and done, and they can be done so quite legitimately. Mm-hmm. But that there is a chance of confusion, what I think of this sort of singular model, the Roman Catholic model, which I think isn't actually the patristic way of.
So my next question for you, Father, is you interact with the Catechism of the Catholic Church on universal power and collegiality. Maybe it's a little bit redundant, but is there anything you would like to add? You interact with that from pages 26 to 29.
Oh, again, can you? Is there a particular quote that you'd like me to? Because I think I've sort of covered most of that, and I did this I particularly did talk about this logic on page 32. I remember addressing this point, which I've just made to you.
Oh, okay. I was about to say, you quote on page 32. The logic behind the papal model seems to be based on understanding the church as self-contained unit on earth, requiring a visible head with full jurisdiction, that the church is one and united in a manner consistent with human organizations. The local churches are thus portions of the whole and can only be considered church while being within the whole under the headship of the Pope. The papacy is the source of unity for the church. Once given that the church is self-contained on earth, then the papal logic and model is sound. The question is whether the church should and needs to be considered as self-contained on earth. If not, then the papal logic does not necessarily apply. End quote.
Yeah. So I basically say, look, if you once you start saying there's one head, and you talk about the church as one body, and you sort of got the head and the magisterium sort of thing over it, then the idea of infallibility and all the rest of this and his jurisdictional powers, etc., all make very good sense. So I think this is really where the issue is, this model between that and the unity of whole local churches, each bishop as a complete church in himself, and their union, as I described before. So I think this is really quite a key area of point to make.
Definitely, yeah, I appreciate that, Father. Yeah, it really helps clarify the Orthodox position there. So I found that very helpful. So this was actually a fun chapter to read for me. You go into from pages 33 through 39. Primacy, Adam Afanasiev or Afanasiev. I've heard various pronunciations of his name.
Afanasiev, I think.
I'm sorry?
Afanasiev, I think is the...
Afanasiev?
Yeah, but
okay.
I hope it's pronounced things
okay,
too.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right either, but Keach or Keach?
Yeah, or Kesich or Keach. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Right, and Byzantines. So let me ask you first. I'm assuming so the Eucharistic ecclesiology. This is referenced a lot in this book, and it's also picked up later by Zizioulas, so then you interact with that too. But basically, what are your main, I guess, thoughts on Afanasiev's ecclesiology? Do you find it helpful or problematic? And also what is it basically too? I'll start with that, and then yeah.
I think it's really focusing on the Eucharist as sort of being the premier mystery or sacrament of the church, and using that to define the church. And so that the Eucharist or the Eucharistic gathering is the full expression of the church, because the body of Christ is present there. And so, yeah, now there's a certain logic to that, and I think a lot of that's where even Ratzinger or Pope Benedict now takes from that for the Eucharistic ecclesiology, is why it's becoming very popular, because it makes solid sense that the church is based around the Eucharist. The body of Christ is fed from the body which we eat, and the Eucharistic gathering is the pinnacle of the expression of the church. So that in itself is very good, but when we look at the reality of the church, it's not made up of just millions of independent little parishes floating around with their priests as in charge. They've got these things like bishops, and they've got these things like the patriarchs and the Pope, and where do all these things fit in? And so this is when we start getting the problems. That's where the critiques start coming in. It's incomplete. Yes, it's true, and that's very important, but that doesn't seem to complete the thing. And so, yeah, that's the weakness in that. But having said that, against, say, vis-a-vis a Protestant view, where let's put aside the Lutherans for a moment, Anglicans, it depends on who you're talking to, but if you say the evangelical views or the non-sacramental ones who basically deny any sacramental presence, then this stands in contrast to them, who basically the Eucharist becomes as a sort of a little memorial service and doesn't found the church. And so I would agree with the Afanasiev and those other ones that, the Eucharist is extremely important. And I think Cardinal Ratzinger, when he wrote his book, was also highlighting that. And I think that's where it sets apart sort of Catholic in the sense of Orthodox, Roman Catholic, probably possibly even Oriental Orthodox, view that the church is very much grounded in the Eucharist. But it's just a matter of getting how do we understand that with the hierarchy and the place of Peter. And so you've got probably the Roman Catholic with that is sort of very strong to almost more than the Eucharist. So someone like Ratzinger was taking that and sort of toning down the sort of stream Vatican I. It's all about the Pope, and the Eucharist is just a side thing on there, and building up more of a Eucharistic understanding of the church. And then on the other hand, Zizioulas, which we'll be talking about in a minute, takes Afanasiev and say, now we need to do something more from the ground up and build up the idea of a bishop and the importance of the bishop. Comes out in Metropolitan Zizoulas's PhD work, and he sort of builds up on that. Yes, but I have my critiques of each of those.
Yeah, that's very helpful. How you situate them and interact with them. I was about to say, you definitely see the development of Eucharistic ecclesiology within the Roman Catholic Church come to conciliar and dogmatic fruition at Vatican II, where it talks about the liturgy and the Eucharist as the source and summit of the faith for Catholics. So that definitely makes sense. But on that note, actually, because from pages 44 through 50, you go through Eucharistic ecclesiology, specifically Henri de Lubac and Afanasiev and Schmiemann. Let me ask you, Henri de Lubac was very much conversant and had a lot of interactions with Afanasiev and other Orthodox thought at the time, and prior to the council and during Vatican II as well, the Orthodox observers and so forth. What do you think of Henri de Lubac's sort of appropriation, if you want to call that, or synthesis of Eucharistic ecclesiology? First of all, what is it? What is his view, and what do you find strengths and weaknesses?
Again, my memory of exactly his view is starting to fade a little bit. I mean, I obviously, as far as Eucharistic ecclesiology goes, I like it, and my dissertation preferred to sort of think about it as a sort of distinct model of a church, but my supervisor preferred to think about it as a perspective on Eucharistic ecclesiology. So it's still grounded in a general school of Eucharistic ecclesiology rather than something completely a different idea. So yes, I do support this, and I think. As far as he goes with it, it's absolutely fine. He's heading in the right direction. I think there's the same weaknesses with it as I would possibly say if you get too strong on it with Afanasiev and Schmiemann and stuff, where they really struggle to explain bishops and things like this. And also the other issues is why monasticism, why this ascetic life and these other things. It gets a bit difficult to explain these. So you sort of collapse into sort of this parish church community thing, and it's slightly getting harder to explain these other roles. So I think he probably goes that way, but he doesn't obviously go so far because he's got the place of papacy in his thought. Right. Yeah. But up from that, I think there is a danger of a sort of an inability to properly sort of contextualize the Eucharist with, I think, the other hierarchical structures.
Gotcha. And if this is too redundant, because I know you mentioned Schmiemann, but was there anything also within him that you found notable or worth criticism, or is it pretty much basically what you've just said?
He's pretty much just building on Afanasiev. He doesn't really take it much further. I think it's not until Zizioulas we see develop in a different way. I mean, as I said before, it does use the importance of a papacy, etc., for the legitimacy, I suppose, of the Eucharist. But yeah, Zizioulas sort of moves beyond. Schmiemann, is sort of very much Afanasiev. I think he develops a little bit more, but not much.
Gotcha. And of course, I was about to say both writers and their important work, co-written and edited with Meindorf, The Primacy of Peter. It's very important, very influential on me. That was one of the first Orthodox works on ecclesiology I read. I really enjoyed it. I sensed something was either not from my own perspective. I was Catholic at the time, so there, of course, I did have a perspective. But within the Orthodox paradigm, though, I could sense like how other Orthodox might not agree with it. And currently, I'm actually going through, and we're about to get to this, but Being as Communion by Zizioulas. And so once I read him and some of his criticisms, I was like, oh, okay, now I see it kind of come to more fruition. And so
I'm just quickly browsing through my book. I did notice that, some of these, Schmiemann talks about two forms of ecclesiology, Eucharistic and universal, so they sort of contrast to them, which I think this is where it's with the early Eucharistic Orthodox writers were making this class. Obviously, Roman Catholics didn't have this, but it was something that was sort of almost like a contrast as an opposition to each other. There's something that had gone wrong with the church when you talk about it in the universal sense. And so this is some of the critiques I have of him, but there's another part where their thought moves to this sort of just trying to distinguish these two things from each other, or separate them, I should say, is more than distinguish.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a fair distinction to make. And I was about to say, speaking of Zizioulas, that was the next that you cover. Eucharist Bishop Church, John Zizioulas, pages 51 through 69. So a longer section there.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, obviously someone like Zizioulas does deserve. I mean, you could write a whole book on Zizioulas. And it's interesting too, because that's one of the titles. I haven't read it yet. Eucharist Bishop Church of John Zizioulas. So what do you think of John Zizioulas' theology in terms of ecclesiology, like Being as Communion, his more specifically that you talk about Eucharist Bishop Church? Do you find, do you largely agree with him and then for somewhere else, so forth?
Ooh, yeah, but he was sort of one of the main people I was critiquing, I suppose, for my PhD. Sort of became his book on Bishop Eucharist Church became my sort of central thing I was sort of critiquing. Actually, Eucharist Bishop Church. The title's interesting. This was one point you asked about how I think about it. I would title it Bishop Eucharist Church. And one of the things I like to say, and I say in the book, I do believe, is that for Zizioulas, the bishop's for the Eucharist. And I would say that the Eucharist is for the bishop. So that's a distinction I would make between the two things. In other words, he sees the bishop primarily as enabling the Eucharist. And where I had a particular problem with him is that he sort of collapses the priesthood into the bishop. So that the Eucharist is led by the bishop. And he's to the point where the presbyters weren't priests prior to the 4th century in his sort of sense. It just had the bishop there. That is where I have a major issue with him. I said, no, the presbyters were priests prior to that. There's no way that change would have happened without being a huge uproar. This is a fundamental difference of role and rank. It's not just something incidental. It goes against the sense that the presbyter and the bishop is fundamentally equal as priest, prophet, and governor of the church, or priest, teacher, and governor, except for power of ordination. And so, this is where I go, no, but this is not, he's having to squash his theory into history, and it doesn't. He's got some evidence to sort of support his idea, but I think fundamentally it doesn't really quite work, where I had an issue with him. And also that it sort of, again, doesn't get past why have something. He does go on to about synods and stuff, to producing the bishops, but he doesn't really have anything to go beyond the sort of a local synod or some sort of universal synod, that Roman Catholic model where everybody's ordained by the one bishop, one pope sort of thing. So he doesn't really get beyond that, nor does his idea really help understand monasticism any better. So just simply lifting the Eucharist out from the parish priest and locating it in the bishop, and then subordinating the parish priest as sort of just as simply a vicar of the bishop, that the parish priest isn't really anything in himself, it's only the bishop that is truly the priest. Yes, he does use it to explain priest. He does, in a sense, get the synods based around we're all the same, so each Eucharist is the same, therefore we recognize each other and we're sort of one. But why should only one ordain and all these things? Why is the Metropolitan? Why the patriarchs? He doesn't. His idea doesn't really, I think, sufficiently explain that. And I think this is some of the critiques and the discipleship issue. Some of the critiques that others have put at him. So, but I think my main problem was when he started talking about presbyters becoming priests, like in the 4th century, as if that was just a sort of an economy. And I thought, no, that doesn't really fit the history of the church of writers like St. John Chrysostom. We're quite clear that they're all the same. So, yes, that is my critique. And yeah, so it was getting better. Obviously, he was explaining the bishop, and I think he really wasn't able to break out of the problem of the Eucharist as being a single congregational act. And how do we explain things outside that congregational action and the structures? Why are they there? Why are they necessary? Are they just simply accidental, etc.?
Yeah, that's very helpful on expanding and interacting with that thought, and you arguing in your book about how chaotic relationships are necessary to kind of go past, in some ways, like you just said, where Zizioulas went. And you also talk about in that section as well how it's the danger of making the priest a vicar of the bishop, which is interesting because I was about to say it's a similar argument of that I know many Orthodox have towards Catholics, that the Pope makes bishops the vicar of the Pope, instead of giving the full dignity and rights as bishops. So would you say that's kind of a similar parallel argument, like towards priests, that Zizioulas is doing in a sense, that it's making the priest kind of unequal in holy orders to some extent?
Yes, it's probably more than necessary. I mean, obviously the bishop's not the same as a presbyter in rank, but he's doing it in the way of almost subordinating them as a servant or an extension of the bishop. And I think this is starting to sneak into some Orthodox things where the bishop sort of orders everybody around like a servant and sort of got all authority or singular authority or singular control. He's a singular priest of the church, and the presbyters are just simply his arms. And we can see this in the example of the in the early church. You have the sin throne on, where the bishop rules with the presbyters. They are the governors of the church. Things like sometimes ordination, it talks about one of the canons, that the bishop should ordain with the consent of all the presbyters. He shouldn't just run around doing things on his own. And to a modern time, like one bishop, presbyters are simply advisors, and then they're no more governors than the deacons or the subdeacons or the clergy. They're all advisors of them. It doesn't matter who the advice comes from. They have a slightly bigger role in things that they do. But when it comes to governing the church, the presbyters actually no more authority than, say, the deacon or a subdeacon or a reader. And so it's just the clergy. And I think this is very problematic to the traditional way of understanding what the presbyter is and his role as governor, teacher, president at the liturgy. By his ordination, we understand the relationship bishop and presbyter in other ways.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's very helpful. And that makes a lot of sense too. Trying to balance out authority and rank with eliminating the intrinsic importance of the sacrament of holy orders of the priesthood and so forth. So that's that makes a lot of sense. I did find, I was about to say, you have a footnote comparing about like Chrysostom on holy orders and so forth, and that was very helpful too, and shed a lot of light on it. So I appreciate that, Father. So now going on, there are some new conversation partners here in this part of the book. You go through critiques of Eucharistic ecclesiology, Baer, Erickson, and I don't want to mispronounce this, but Ludovicius?
Ludovicus.
Ludovicus. Okay, so from pages 70 through 73.
Yeah.
Basically, what are they doing there? What is Baer, Erickson, and Ludovico's doing.
Right. So they are sort of raising some critiques of the Eucharistic model, again on the idea of it just being the gathering of the faithful around the Eucharist. Now, the Eucharistic model can have two type of emphases as well, is another point to make. One is on the act of communion of the body and blood of Christ as the Eucharist, and that is just about communion. The other one is the gathering together as the faithful, as the church, for the offering of the whole process of the Eucharist, from the actual offering and receiving. And so I think sometimes there's different emphasis. But anyway, these were saying, look, this is just not quite enough to represent the church. I think Ludovicos was much more focusing on where does discipleship come from. He's a bit more the equality of the presbyter. So he was having a critique. And Behr and Erickson were talking more about baptism, or where does baptism fit into this, and sort of using that as a way of just sort of defining the boundaries of the church, sort of thing. So these are some other ideas, just to sort of say, Eucharistic liturgy is really cool, but it doesn't seem to quite deal with all these other issues, and how do we fit them into place?
Yeah, I was about to say, because the first time I ever heard of Eucharistic ecclesiology, I had mixed feelings about it, because I was like, well, that makes sense from the perspective of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, when, during the divine liturgy, the priest prays over the gifts, prays the prayer of the epiclesis. It makes, I really, and also the citations from St. Ignatius of Antioch and so forth, which hopefully we'll get to. My intuitive thinking was like, well, hang on a second. What about in cases of schism? Who determines the Eucharist is valid? Who determines that the presider is in communion or not? Who's he in communion with? And who are the faithful lady in communion with too? Because it's all like, that's what I appreciate about your work, is it's all extensive, because it's like, yes, definitely yes to Eucharistic ecclesiology, but these other questions, I find that in your work in Zizioulas, it's like these need to be answered, because it's like otherwise it can easily become, if we're not careful, and I know none of the advocates of Eucharistic ecclesiology would ever go there, but it could deteriorate to a form of congregationalism, which Zizioulas talks about in being as communion, and that could just lead to basically a high church Protestantism, essentially. But yeah, that's my sort of little.
No, that is right. That is one of the critiques of it, and I think this is. No, because the communion things, Zizioulas does try to bring that out. I just think he falls short of being able to do that properly, because, okay, you've got all these bishops, but where do you draw? Well, we celebrate the Eucharist, and where do you draw the line of who is and who isn't in the church? And just because you're doing the Eucharist isn't quite enough, or just saying the right creed, is that enough? Well, we've got all these ideas of schismatics before. What about schisming from? How does that work? Why is there all this patristic material? So yeah, something more needed to be said.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. And so now, going on from pages 74 to 75, you ask a really good question, and I'll ask it back to you. The title of it is, what is missing in the literature? And I know maybe that's a little bit repetitive, but essentially, I'm assuming you would say that the theodic relationships is missing in the literature.
Yes, I've tried to plug a gap, which I felt that none of the theories was essentially comprehensive in itself. The papacy is sort of much more comprehensive in a sense, but it almost struggles a little bit to ground the importance of the Eucharist. Well, if you follow the Pope and things like that, and you're a member of a thing, Eucharist gets you some more grace and things, but what's it to do with actually being a member of the church? I'm baptized and I follow the Pope, therefore all is good. If I go to Eucharist, well, it's nice, but now it's obviously been built in a bit more, but the model in itself, it struggles a little bit to give a full place of that. And the Eucharistic ecclesiology fails to do with the hierarchical structures up beyond the local parish or the local diocese, and as I said, the other things of relationships of the disciples to each other. And going back to Alice's work, he sort of pulls about 6 models. He suggests one of his own, but none of them quite seem to be comprehensive. So it's sort of like, is there a gap where I can hope? Well, I try to. I don't know if I have succeeded or not, to offer something which ticks more boxes, that is more comprehensive. It sort of is a better way of, oh, right, this helps to explain why we've got this, and this. That's why we have these relationships. That's why the structure should be in this form. This is why we have to have these checks and balances, etc. That's why we have these personal relationship structures. And yeah, and that's what I've tried to sort of plug in and offer a theory which I think goes better from that. I can't be a judge of my own work. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Father. I appreciate that. I wanted to ask, so is it fair to say that you're saying that the Catholic perspective fails to logically justify the necessity or importance of the, I guess, soteriological necessity of the Eucharist, even though that is Catholic dogma, that is necessary, in light of the fact that it seems the dogma of being in communion with the Pope as necessary for salvation, do you think overshadows that, like logically speaking?
Yeah, I've raised it as a thing. I can't sort of nail it down in an absolute sort of logical sense. It's sort of an intuition or a sense that you can almost get rid of the Eucharist if you're just baptized there and you just go along to guitar sessions and stuff. Then you are sort of a member of a church sort of thing, as long as the priest who baptized you is in communion with the. Well, what do you mean by in communion with? But ordained by a bishop who's ordained by the Pope, for example, and in good relations with them in a sort of canonical sense. Even if you start going through some of the ecumenical documents now, where if you're simply baptized anywhere, you're sort of in the path of salvation. It starts, yes, and where they do talk, even open up to Protestants, their whole Eucharistic ecumenical stuff is getting questionable. It's like, yes, the fullness has been, but the bodies of Protestants which don't actually have the Eucharist as a things sort of somehow able to be saved in there somehow from the church, it does start lessening the need for the Eucharist and what it means for the church. And perhaps also the need for the Eucharist as a gathering, the people gathering together. And I think something in COVID brought this out, whereas the importance of, regardless of a chance of sickness, of us gathering in one place is not enough for just the Eucharist be offered and then by a priest and a singer or something like that, and then taken around to everyone's house. There is something about the gathering, the Eucharistic gathering together, which is an important part of being Christian, is coming together with the faithful and not ceasing to do that. And that is something we do regardless. We do it, and we don't prevent anybody from coming in who is a member of faithful, because being present in there, unless you simply cannot physically get there, is actually an important part of being part of the church. And if you fail to gather with the church, you're no longer part of the church. And that's an idea which is quite Eucharistic focused, being there at the liturgy. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. And one thing that came into my mind, because I was wondering how you would respond to his work, because you wrote this back in 2018, is that correct?
Yeah, I started this between 2012 and 2015. I finished it there, and I published a book in 2016, the start of 2016. I basically just took my PhD thesis and tidied it up a little wee bit and published it, but it's full of typos.
Gotcha, because I was wondering, let me actually pull it up here. Can you see my screen, Father?
Yes, yeah.
So I read this book earlier this year, Primacy in the Church, from Vatican I to Vatican II, an Orthodox Perspective, written by Giannopoulos. Came out around 2019, if I recall. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts, if you had read this or heard of him, because he kind of weighs the various thinkers within Orthodoxy on ecclesiology. He goes over, Meyendorff, Schmiemann, Zizioulas, very much one of the theologians of the Fanar. Patriarch Bartholomew wrote the foreword to it. So I was just wondering if you had read this or heard of it. And if not, it's fine. But yeah, I was just curious. So.
No, it's very interesting. And so it says from Vatican I to Vatican II. So that's an interesting title. And he's dealing with Orthodox thinkers between those councils.
Yes, it's very extensive. Like he goes over, and also Catholic too, because he actually goes over some of the Gallican theologians. So it's very comprehensive. It's actually really fascinating. And he goes through Ratzinger, de Lubac, the Nouvelle Theologie, Congar. So yeah, it's really it's pretty comprehensive. But it was interesting though because he Eucharistic ecclesiology and primacy, synodality comes up a lot. He seems to pretty much side with Zizioulas on most things. He does have his criticisms of Zizioulas too, so it's interesting though. But he does. I was about to say because it's interesting because he says things similar to what you say in terms of like the equal rights and privileges of New Rome and so on and so forth. He might take it maybe differently from you because he's very much pro like Patriarch Bartholomew is the primus in the church, in the Orthodox Church today. Yeah. Alrighty. So the next section actually. So we're going back to from ecclesiologists. Now we're going back to the Bible and the Church Fathers. Chapter 2 is entitled Fathers, Bishops, Popes, and Mystics on page 76. And the first section of that chapter is Moses and Peter Scriptures on page 76. I was about to say that's an interesting comparison, Moses and Peter. And so I was just wondering what were your thoughts in bringing that to the conversation on ecclesiology.
I was looking at Moses. The church of the New Testament is actually the same as the church of the Old Testament, except it's sort of transformed for the new covenant. But in many ways, you find it grounded in the Old Testament. And so when we've got, it's interesting with Moses, he appoints 70 elders, and then you see Christ appointing 70 elders as the disciples to go off to preach. You can see there's similarities here. That is, Christ is like a new Moses, and who's a sort of a singular head, and Moses is a sort of a central point of ordination. But all the 70 receive the same grace that he has. But they're appointed to look after 50s and 60s, in the congregation. And then important cases would go to him and things like that. And again, this is sort of feeds into Orthodox. We've got either in the case of bishop and presbyters. Presbyters normally deal with minor issues among the congregations. They hear confessions and deal with daily routines of marriage relations and bits and pieces. But more important, serious cases need to go up to the bishop. Or the bishop deals with the normal day-to-day routine tasks in his diocese. But again, if there's a big clash with a presbyter or something like that, then this should go up to the synod of the bishops, the metropolitans, etc., to hear it a bit higher up. So we see this in the Old Testament. But what I found particularly interesting was that the 70 elders sort of received the same spirit as Moses did. And this is to point out that the equality of their role as such, their governing role, though in the context of Moses as their head. And so again, I see this with Christ, with Peter. Peter is singled out, and then the other apostles receive the same thing. So here's the keys to the kingdom. However you can forgive him. And the other ones, whatever you forgive, and there's the same authority. You forgive sins, and whatever you attain is held. There is a sense also of the singularity and equality there. So I went back to the Old Testament and say, hey, look, that is in there. We see that pre-done, and then I'm matching that up with what happens with St. Peter. And I think this is a very important point here, and St. Peter does do that. And the section of the rock, I think this is a famous issue, and I'm very much, I can use a rock in both ways. It is a faith, and faith is a rock, but it is the man himself is the rock. And you see this in Ephesians, where it talks about churches founded on Christ and the apostles Christ is the chief foundation stone, but the others are the bedrock, the base of the church. And so, yes, and each church is founded around the bishop, in a sense, was sort of a rock, a place of stability for the churches, and gathered around the sees of metropolitans, and each level, the one who does the ordinations, etc., is a sort of like the place of Peter, the singularity, the one who gives out the same grace to the ones below, sort of under him as such. So yeah, I see that multiple levels, and obviously Rome par excellence was the See of Peter. The rock is a sort of a central focus of all the union of all the churches. But where I had my difficulty with Vatican I, for example, just as a sort of symbol of this thinking, is where the rock and St. Peter become exclusive to the Bishop of Rome. It is the only Peter and see, the only Peter, the only rock, in a way which not the other bishops aren't, in their own contexts. And I think this is reflected in the, you get it in Pope Gregory VII decretals, where he starts saying, I can ordain a bishop, all bishops, I can ordain clergies wherever I like. I have a bishop over all bishops, I've got a bishop. And this is that singular model where the papacy, he's got direct immediate authority in all, everywhere, over all faithful sort of thing. And in a debate with another person, asked the question, if the Pope turns up into a diocese and there was a question of an ordination or request to serve, and they conflicted with each other, the bishop said no, and the Pope said yes. Whom should the cleric obey, the Pope or his bishop? Obviously, Roman Catholic would say, well, the Pope, because he in a sense has immediate power everywhere, and so his authority rides in there. And I said, well, in the Orthodox sense, no, it's the local bishop. Yes, the local bishop may have to be in communion with the Pope, but and as far as his own diocese, he is the singular voice of consent. There's no other voice. There's no other asking permission. No one else can interfere with that. It's a singular voice. It's a singular statement of yes or no. And so that, I think, helps to highlight the difference of the two models. And yeah, so this is where I think Roman Catholicism, or what happened at the time of the schism, but before that, and then what was reinforced after that in the way the papacy became more and more centralized, etc., to what it is now, that was a diversion from what was before as a center of multiple sees. Anyway, so that is all sort of tied up with this Peter and Moses and things, the equality and the singularity at the same time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Father. That was very good and extensive, going biblical theology all the way through the modern, present, and medieval issues there too. This one was really fun to read too. It's brought up a lot in all these theologians that we've been talking about. One Eucharist, Ignatius of Antioch, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, on page 84. How would you describe Ignatius of Antioch's ecclesiology? Do you think that he's, teaching Eucharistic ecclesiology, as many say, or is that partially true? Like, how do you interact with a patristic source?
Yeah, well, it depends how we define Eucharistic ecclesiology. Obviously, the Eucharist is essential for him, but I don't see him as that. He's episcopal centric. That the church is that defined around the bishop and the presbyter. As a matter of fact, he's not just bishop-centric. He's bishop-centric, but it's a bishop and the presbyters and the deacons. It's a whole hierarchical structure, and it's not just the bishop alone apart from the deacons, the presbyters. So yes, I think his emphasis is on that, and more as I just discussed that the Eucharist is for him, and so, given that you're with the bishop, then you participate in the Eucharist, and the bishop means that there's one Eucharistic, in the sense of the union of the presbyters with the bishop means that each Eucharist is the one and the same, and so even if it's in different parishes, each presbyter is offering the same Eucharist as the others, and they're all in union. Because again, the Eucharist is about coming to union with the body of Christ. It's unity, it's becoming one. And this is why the bishop's so important, as he unites each congregation so that they're not separated and doing their own thing. Their service becomes one. It's the one liturgy, the one thing being done. They're in agreement because they're with the bishop, and he's a sense of unifying them. But the Eucharist in each parish is a complete church. The whole presence of Christ, all the saints, all the angels is present in every Eucharist. But the Eucharist of a presbyter apart from the bishop is empty. It's not in unity. It's not in communion with Christ. In a sense, it's sort of his own little bubble in itself, and it becomes separated out. and then it ceases to be what it is. So the presbyter can only offer with the consent of the bishop. He hasn't got the right to just do it of his own will as such. So he's always in harmony. But nevertheless, the presbyter is truly the priest, truly Christ is present there. It doesn't need the bishop to be somehow sticking his finger in there to make it. What is necessary is simply the consent of the bishop. That is done with his consent, is done, and the presbyter is ordained by, but not just that bishop, the bishop of that see. He doesn't have to be reordained by every bishop. And this is another thing I think in modern Orthodox. He's on the altar, concentrated by a bishop of the see. But nowadays you've got these anti-mincians that each new bishop sort of gives out. I don't think it's necessary, as long as it's an anti-mincian of the bishop of that see at some stage, because the anti-mincian is just simply the altar, a portable altar. This is like the old marble altars which the Roman Catholics had. The portable altars are sort of stone ones which had the relics in them. It's the same thing. It's cloth rather than stone. But otherwise it's an altar. But it's sort of twisted it, changing its meaning. But in any case, the point is that it's in the unity. It's in a parish that is connected with the episcopal see as such. Yeah, and so that's what I think Ignatius of Antioch is basically teaching. And so I think that people talk, when he talks about one Eucharist, just distorting him a little bit and making him say what he's not really quite saying in that sense. So.
Yeah, that's helpful, Father. I appreciate that. So would you, just to sort of summarize, St. Ignatius of Antioch, in your estimation, is hierarchical ecclesiology more so than Eucharistic ecclesiology, even though Eucharistic ecclesiology, of course, is involved within hierarchical ecclesiology?
Yes, I do believe that he is hierarchical. And one interesting point I'd like to mention from him, and it goes back to the scriptures, is that the apostles appointed presbyters in every place. And this is one of the things, one of the chief reasons I wrote my PhD, though it ended up developing into something more, is that in each place, it's not just a bishop that is ordained, it's a bishop and presbyters. So that is Christ, the church is founded on Christ and the apostles. So in each place, Christ, vis-a-vis the icon of the bishop, and the apostles and the icons of the presbyters are established in each place. So the church is not simply just on Christ, it's on Christ and the apostles, showing the co-rule of humanity with divinity. So we reign with God. And so this is why you've got the presbyter standing there. And so a local church organization is incomplete with just the bishop. It needs the bishop with the presbyters. It needs a synod there to properly manifest Christ and the apostles, and with the deacons, obviously, to serve. But the core is Christ, the group together. And this is why Peter singled out as a rock, as Christ, as the presence of Christ, to sort of be the one that harmonizes the man as such. Because if we didn't have one singled out from us, we wouldn't have the place of the bishop to single and unite us. And you can talk what you like about uniting around Christ, but unless it's just manifest tangibly in a specific human being, it just doesn't work. We'd all get our own opinions and run off. And so I think this is something else you see in Ignatius. It's not just the bishop. It's a bishop and presbyters, and they form a sort of a core council, or the Moses and the Sanhedrin sort of thing, talking about Moses' seat and stuff like that, or Christ and the apostles. So that's really important part of understanding the church structure, the local church structure. It's Christ and the apostles. It's the bishop and the presbyters.
Yeah, that's very extensive. I appreciate that, Father. The next section, President St. Justin Martyr, on page 88. So how does he fit into your work? And also, I was interested that you included him because most works on ecclesiology within this area of Eucharistic ecclesiology and primacy and so forth, at least to my knowledge, I could be wrong, I definitely see St. Ignatius of Antioch, but I don't really recall reading much about St. Justin Martyr within this context. So I found that.
No. Yeah. It's not commonly used. I've put him in there because he talks about the Sunday worship there, and he uses this proestos and things. And this is one of the things in Zizioulas sort of talks about the president and sort of ties it to the bishop. But I've taken him to, no, he uses the word president, he doesn't actually say presbyter, or doesn't say bishop, he just says president. And then you look at St. John Chrysostom, who also speaks about the president when he talks about the church and the president of liturgy. And this is a generic term for whoever's leading the liturgy, whether it be a bishop or a presbyter or the senior presbyter in there. And so I just thought I'd pull it out and sort of making, no, it's the term he's using isn't sort of exclusive necessarily just of a bishop. He's using something more generic to speak of a wider sense that there are bishops and presbyters, but there is one that leads. And so you see this in Orthodox liturgies today, that one bishop will stand, presbyter will stand at the front of the altar, and the rest will stand around. One is the leader, one is the protos. There's only one, even with presbyters together, only one reads the prayers. The others, well, the others do it silently, one reads it aloud. But it's only done by one. So that's an important part. And I think in ancient Roman practice, it was done similar as well, that the one would stand up and lead, and the rest would sort of gather around the side. I think in ancient Rome in the 8th century, often on the day-to-day services, the presbyters wouldn't stand around the altar, they would just stand in the presbytery, and the bishop, the Pope alone would stand up and lead the liturgy. But on feast days, they'd all gather around the altar. But again, the Pope would be the first, and he would only want to do certain actions. So the importance of the singularity is there. But anyway, that again at Justin Martyr just sort of reinforces that sense. I thought I'd just refer to him to help bring that out.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and it was definitely an interesting section. So I found that definitely a unique contribution of yours. So yeah, thank you for that, Father. And then next you go over apostolic tradition in Saint Hippolytus on page 89. So now we have your first Latin church father that you incorporate. So why did you include him? How does he sort of differ, I guess, in style from the other two Eastern fathers you went over?
Right. Yeah, I think because Metropolitan John Zizioulas makes a point of him to sort of support the bishop was only the priest and not the presbyters. And so I just sort of mentioned him and looked at him and said, actually, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that. I don't think Metropolitan John Zizioulas was justified in making his conclusion from the text. It could be taken that way, but I don't think it is necessitated on the text. So I thought I'd just look at it and sort of do a little critique of it to point out that it can be read in a different way. So yeah, it was just sort of a side thing to help. Because a lot of people, I think, Metropolitan sort of uses this to support his theory. So I had to sort of go through and
go one through
his own evidence and say, no, it doesn't quite. I can read this another way. It doesn't quite say that. Just to open the question that he hasn't proved his case, sort of thing. So.
Yeah, that's definitely legitimate, showing an alternative interpretation. It's always helpful also as a reader viewing the different interpretations of different patristic sources. Reading them, of course, the primary themselves, then also reading the secondary literature theologians say. So that's definitely helpful, and I appreciate that. All right, and so this is interesting because if I recall correctly, this is brought up in either Afanasiev or Schmiemann, or maybe both, but Universal Church in St. Cyprian of Carthage. And you discussed that on page 91. Why did you bring up St. Cyprian of Carthage? I see that you're interacting with Zizioulas' interpretation of him. Is this another instance, I guess, of critique, essentially?
Well, St. Cyprian's a bit more than that. I think St. Cyprian is one of those that sort of Athanasius and Schmiemann sort of almost opposed to Eucharistic ecclesiology. He's sort of bringing in this universal ideas, and I was basically saying, no, his ideas are really helpful to help us expand beyond the local church. So St. Ignatius is great for giving us a sense of what the local church is, what it is to be a member of the local church, and that's to be with the bishop and the presbyters, and who's with them is in the church. If you're not, there's nothing to be called a church without them, sort of thing. So he's great for that. But St. Cyprian moves beyond that, and how do we relate the churches to each other? How do we bind them into sort of more of a wider community?
Right.
And so I think his work is very helpful for that. And obviously all sorts of people have taken all sorts of different views on that. I draw from him, or at least I believe I draw from him, that the idea of Peter and each bishop and a sort of forming the sort of rock of each diocese, and then those being united around sort of wider synods and those in turn around other, the patriarchs or the exarchs, and well, he's very helpful. So he's one of, with St. Ignatius and St. Cyprian, I think of sort of two early fathers which really laid the foundations of ecclesiology out. And again, that communion, and I think another important point of St. Cyprian is that to be in the church is to be with the hierarchical structure of the church. When you say in the community, we talk about a hierarchy. We're not just talking about the Eucharist. There's those questions you were asking before. What is a schism? What is a sense of whose Eucharist is this and that? That's why we have this hierarchical structure. You're with the hierarchy, you're with your bishop, then you take Eucharist with the bishop. And the bishops are known because they're in communion with the other bishops, they're with the metropolitans, and they're with the patriarchs, sort of thing. And that's how we know we're in the church, because we're in this hierarchical structure. We're with these hierarchs. And I can say my priest was ordained by this bishop who's in communion with that patriarch who's in communion with that patriarch, and they all hold this same faith and stuff. So when I got baptized, I was using the nice thing, the Constantinople Creed, just as they were using it. We all had the same creed, we're all baptized in the same thing. So this shows the unity of faith, sort of thing. The two prongs, the unity of hierarchy and unity of faith. And you see this in the canon law. You've got the heresy, which is a difference in faith, but you also got schism, which is separating from your due hierarchical lead, a presbyter serving against the will of his bishop is in schism. Bishops serving out of communion with his metropolitan is in schism. The metropolitan away from his patriarch is in schism, and his whole synod is in schism with them in that sense. And this is just as much cutting off from the church as a wrong faith. And that's based around this hierarchical chain or links. So St. Cyprian is very good to start to develop that idea, and being in the church is part of that. And his one, I think, where he differs with some of St. Augustine, and I think this is a difference between Orthodox and modern Roman Catholic ideas, is that the Holy Spirit only abides in the church. And so while you can be baptized in the church, leave the church, and when you return, you're not baptized again. So immediately leaving the church, your baptism isn't sort of suddenly removed, or nor is your priesthood. So if I went off the schism for a little while and I came back, I can come back as a presbyter. I don't have to get reordained or anything like that, or I lose my ordination. I mean, I could have been frocked or whatever, and it's most often happens, but I can be received back in orders. St. Augustine would say about therefore you can still, a presbyter can still baptize if outside the church, because he's still a presbyter. Whereas St. Cyprian makes it clearer that while you're still a presbyter in the form of that, or having received the grace of the Holy Spirit is not present outside. And so there's no Holy Spirit. And so the baptism, though the ritual is there, the Holy Spirit is not able to fulfill it, because the Holy Spirit is not found outside the hierarchical structures of the church, sort of thing. And therefore there's no baptism outside and a regenerative act, because there's no Holy Spirit, there's no ordinations, etc., because there's no Holy Spirit. There is a ritual, there's a form still, and that can have meaning to some degree, but it's empty of grace as such, and when you separate from the church. And he's talking about this hierarchical structure, which is certainly Augustine will also talk about when he talks about being in communion with the church. That's all they talk about. Not talk about I have been baptized, therefore I'm in communion with the church. No, you're in communion with the church because you are taking communion from a presbyter of the church who's in communion with his bishop and ordained, and who's in, etc. So that's what we mean by being in the church, is this hierarchical structure. And again, Cyprian is great for bringing all that out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that came to my mind as you were talking was, because of course I know there's different interpretations between Roman Catholics and Orthodox on St. Cyprian's ecclesiology, his universal ecclesiology, and the implication of a universal head, and being the center of unity being with the see of St. Peter. What does he mean by that? And his exegesis of Matthew 16 and so forth. But what I wanted to ask, though, was specifically, it seems like from just the few early church fathers that you've mentioned so far, St. Justin Martyr and St. Ignatius of Antioch for the East, and then St. Cyprian, and then, of course, we'll go into St. Leo the Great and others. Do you think it's fair to say that, on the whole, overall, or to a large extent, the Eastern Fathers, when it comes to ecclesiology, are focusing more on the local level, and the Western Latin Fathers are focusing more on the universal level?
Not really. No, not really. It's sort of hard to. I don't see any opposition between St. Ignatius and St. Cyprian, for example. They're both saying the same thing. They're both bishop-centered, Eucharist-centered, mystery-centered. They're saying exactly the same. So I don't see any opposition. I don't see any opposition between the universal church that St. Cyprian's introducing, sort of universalized. No. Well, of course, there has to be a structure, a sort of a universal, a worldwide. Let's use worldwide rather than universal structure around of communion. And he's a sense of Western Father. I mean, he is in Africa, and he's in Carthage. It was underneath the Patriarch of Rome, sort of thing, and in the sort of in the West. So he isn't a Western. I mean, they wrote in Greek, but most of them did in those early centuries. Even if he had closer ties to Firmilian in Asia, nevertheless, he was a Western Father. I think when you talk about the papacy, the bishops of Rome, of course, they're focusing more on their role as the first see, and that there is a sort of universal sense to that for all the church to be gathered around himself. So I think you'll find much more literature which is focused on that in the West than you will in the East, because they're not so interested in that particular point. And Rome's that. But if you look at the ecumenical patriarchate now, as effectively continuing the place of Rome in the church, it does spend a lot more time talking about its role in doing that, and everybody needs to come into communion with it, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think quite correctly, though I think there's some issues with it, which is starting to slip a little bit into what I'd call Roman Catholic papacy ideas. Nevertheless, the way it's speaking now is very much in the same way as Rome spoke in the first few centuries. It just...
Yeah, and this is a great transition, too, because, of course, in the next section, you talk about Peter, the center of unity, Leo the Great, on page 100. And let me ask you this, because I've read Orthodox authors that they argue that St. Leo the Great is, well, of course, he's an Orthodox saint. So both communions, Catholic and Orthodox, venerate him. I believe it was Gaute in his book on the papacy, its historic origins to the present, makes a lot of arguments of St. Leo the Great's ecclesiology and theology as being sort of like theologumenon and so forth. Of course, Roman Catholics argue that he taught a Vatican I level type of primacy. How do you view St. Leo the Great's ecclesiology? Do you think it is intrinsically Catholic, or that it makes a lot of sense what Catholics are doing with Leo the Great, or do you think that they're wrong in misinterpreting him and he's actually has a more nuanced approach? And I guess it's mainly because of words like, the chief, the head, he's the successor of St. Peter, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of strong languages, just prima facie of Roman authority.
Yeah, look, I think it's hard because they're reading back from modern ideas back into him, and of course they're seeing what they want to see in him. And but having said that, he is definitely someone that is opposed. His witness is opposed to sort of every bishop's the same, and then there's the metropolitans and the patriarchs are accidental structures on the church, which you sometimes get in some Orthodox things, that these things just transitional, transient, and just made up just here and there. The only thing that's important is the actual bishop and things. So I think no, that's wrong. There is a real place for St. Peter. There's a real place for Rome, and it had a really high importance. So what's happened, it goes back, as I said before, when I was talking about the Pope turning up to the local diocese and who has authority. This is where I think they're not reading him right. He was very strong in protecting the rights of metropolitans over exarchs. Now, when I talked before, you've got bishops who are in provinces, and so every 10 bishops would have a metropolitan who would ordain all the bishops in that thing. Then above that, you have the patriarchs in their cities. But in between, and especially you get this with Constantinople and Rome, in the Roman Empire, what you got was the provinces, and the church mapped itself onto the imperial structure because it was very helpful for the church structure to be mapped onto something tangible, which helped set the church structure in place. But it wasn't slavishly following that. So if they knew, so what they have is the metropolitan cities like Ephesus and Nicomedia and stuff. They were metropolitan cities. The bishop there was given greater honor than the bishops of the other cities. And he was in charge of the synod as such in the territory, the region of which that was Roman territory, that's metropolitan see. Now later, when another city was made up to metropolitan see in the secular sense, the church said, you can give a title and honor, but he never replaces the church one. The church one's already established. That's our structure. We don't follow the empire, but even though we use the empire as a tool to organize ourselves at the start, we're not following it as such. And I think this is an important distinction to be made. So anyway, so you've got the provinces. They were grouped together in what confusingly, but they were called dioceses in the Roman Empire, which was a number of regions. Now, the diocese was led by exarch, what was called an exarch. Now, in Alexandria, the Patriarch of Alexandria, it was fitted one diocese. So the Patriarch and the exarch were one and the same. Same with Antioch, it was one diocese and the Patriarch. Now, Jerusalem almost had a little subsection of that diocese, and the church carved out its own little patriarchate inside of there. So 3 or 4 provinces and were given under Jerusalem. But Constantinople was patriarch of 3 exarchs, Thracia, Pontus, and Asia. And Rome had about 6 or 7 dioceses under its patriarchal control. And so these were the heads of these dioceses, super regions, were called exarchs. So what often you'll see is Leo writing to these exarchs, they don't interfere with the ordinations of the metropolitans in there. You have no right to do so. That's their role, not yours. And so he was very, what I think is a critique of the Roman Catholic thing is that each jurisdiction has its level and no one has a right to interfere inside that. And I think St. Leo strongly supported that. Yes, Rome is center, you must be in communion of Rome, Peter spoke through me, etc. Fine, but he respected the rights and the jurisdictions of the other sees. So even if he was interfering a little bit in Jerusalem when there wasn't a patriarch, he'd send his own man to do his, that's fine. He has overall general care of the church, and if the structure's not there, he'll try to fix it. Sometimes he overextends himself, just like Constantinople, we would say today, has overextended itself. Doesn't mean that it's wrong or it ceases to be that, or what it says is necessarily right. Just because Constantinople says that does this, and therefore it's right. So we must look back at history, and not everything that necessarily is done by a pope or said by a pope is necessarily correct. But in principle, yeah, he was right in that the Patron See was the center of all the communion of the churches. He had a general overview of the churches, but he always protected the rights of the jurisdictions underneath him. So he wouldn't go into another metropolitan area and ordain a bishop. That's the right of a metropolitan. And so he was very strong in guarding those. And these sorts of things are not being picked out by a lot of Roman Catholics. They just take the Petrine stuff and fail to really go in depth through all what he understood and how he implemented his authority and power, and these subtle nuances where the difference between Roman Orthodox really hits the road. That's why I like the decrees of Pope Gregory VII, because they really clarify where the papacy had separated from the Orthodox tradition, and there weren't things that were necessarily there before. That's why he made the decrees.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. I guess a sort of similar question, because the next section you go into is Universal Bishop, St. Gregory the Great on page 106. Let me ask you this. So, of course, there's the Universal Bishop controversy that has been talked about a lot in these discussions. So, basically, where do you fall on that? Do you agree? Here's a question, too. Would you agree with sort of Demopoulos' paper that came out a few years ago about the Universal Bishop controversy, essentially? Basically, the view that St. Pope Gregory the Great is denouncing is more or less the modern Catholic position at Vatican I.
Yeah, I know a lot of Roman Catholics say, no, he's talking about something else. But ultimately, yes, that's exactly what he's denouncing. This is where, again, this is a critique of it, is that he refused to be called universal, even though they wanted to grant him the honor. So, and he refused to take it because he said if there's one universal head, then if he falls, the whole church goes with him. And this is exactly why Roman Catholics have to have the doctrine of infallibility, because if the Pope falls, the whole church goes down with him. And this is exactly why they developed it. And so it's precisely that thing he's talking about is not allowed. But it also goes back to St. Cyprian a little bit. There's no bishop of bishops. In other words, the Pope doesn't, or no, is not a bishop of all the earth, as the immediate bishop, episcopal jurisdiction everywhere. He can ordain someone anywhere. He can walk in and celebrate the Eucharist and push the other bishop out of his side because he's actually the bishop sort of thing. Yeah, and I think this is exactly what St. Gregory is going against, this sort of idea of it. And I think people don't quite appreciate it enough. There is a reason why the emperors called the ecumenical councils. And this is one of the problems that the ecumenical patriarch is facing now, is that no bishop could order all the other bishops into council. Because if he could, then if that council spoke heresy, then the whole church would have officially agreed to heresy, and it ceased to be the rock of St. Peter according to the faith. Whereas if an emperor calls it, and because it's not all bishops actually turn up, if it makes a mistake, then it's on the emperor's head and stuff, and just those bishops involved are in trouble, but the church doesn't fall with it. This is why afterwards you've got all this, each patriarch and each metropolitan has to accept the council and stuff and confirm it as being truly a council, even though the council, if it is true, is complete at the council. It's not something like afterwards that it comes true. It's true at the council, but they're affirming that the truth is actually that it hasn't spoken falsely. So that shows two things, that the council could speak falsely and that there was no guarantee. So, but there's this idea that you cannot have the one head because the whole church can go down there. And I think Roman Catholics basically accept that's why they have to have the Pope as sort of infallible to prevent that happening. I think people are not quite know that enough. And the other thing St. Gregory I'd like to pull out is he recognizes the triple Petrine See, that there is one Petrine See and three bishops, that it's Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch are the one Petrine See, each the See of Peter, which means they're each the rock, they're each stable, they're each go on, forever. They each have the rights of Peter. Rome is first among them, and in a sense is the type of what they are. In a sense, they model themselves on Rome in many ways, in this to keep the singularity of them, so we don't have three churches going off. But at the same time, they're slightly truncated, so that if one of them falls, the whole church doesn't go down. The church can be united around the other Petrine See as such. And you can see this in the fact that the Pope never ordained the other patriarchs. They were all self-ordained, and their own synods ordained them. So that there was never a sense where the Bishop of Rome, until post-schism, ordained all the bishops. This was not allowed either. Again, because if that happened, if he goes into heresy, the whole church would be would fall with them. So again, you're protecting this by spreading it out to allow human weakness, human fallibility to take place. So in the sense of rejection, that man can be controlled such by God that he can always speak without error in any case. It doesn't mean there's not the grace of God that helps people to be inspired and to speak without error, but there's no guarantee, because this works with the freedom of the recipient. And so if the freedom is used badly, then there's no guarantee just because you're in an office that you will not become a heresy or speak heresy. So this was a deliberate design in the church, which again, Roman Catholic has twisted from distorted from its early things, which is again why you don't have a universal church with one sort of magisterium around this whole idea. That's not what we see in the first millennium. So Gregory is actually sort of a proponent. So while he's very strong in the place of the papacy, he also recognizes the Patron See in 3. Yeah, I like to point out that the Roman Orthodox Church actually still has those two. And if you take the understanding of Rome, New Rome, Constantinople as New Rome, and it's really very important to understand it as New Rome, therefore it carries us equal privileges of Old Rome. The privileges of Rome have never left the Orthodox Church either. They just continue in New Rome. And so nothing of that was present in the church as far as Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, the Patron Sees, as the actual authority has been lost. Yes, Old Rome as such is separated from the church, from the Orthodox perspective, but nothing of the privileges, the meaning, the centre of union, the Petrine quality has left the Orthodox Church. It still continues to this day. So yeah, that's just building on St. Gregory the Great. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Father. So I guess I have two questions. Usually what I hear responded to arguments like this, the Catholic side, is these two arguments. Usually they'll say, and I know when you've debated, Eric Ybarra makes this argument in his article that he wrote a while ago on St. Pope Gregory the Great and the Universal Bishop controversy. Basically, him and other Catholic apologists will say that in Pope St. Gregory's mind, universal was sort of being referred to where there's only one bishop at all and there's no other bishops at all, and so that he would basically be this subsumed bishop and he's protecting the episcopacy of the other bishops, but he still believes essentially a Catholic view of primacy, but he doesn't want to say that he's interpreting universal as to sort of negate any other bishops, where it's just like the Bishop of Rome. And then also the second objection is usually they'll cite from St. Pope Gregory the Great, who can doubt that Constantinople is subject to the Holy See or something along those lines, and that Rome had jurisdictional authority over Constantinople. So how would you respond to those objections? Because those are pretty much the most common ones I've seen.
Yeah, well, the first one is it's precisely the things of Rome now, which is when I talk about the Pope and the Bishop coming together in the same place, and who do you follow? If you say that the Pope does that, the very fact that the Pope has priority over the Bishop is denial of the Bishop as Bishop. The Bishop as a Bishop is a singular voice of consent, service, and any ecclesiastical function within his diocese. He is a singular. As soon as another voice stands in and says something different, then you are denying the Bishop as Bishop, and this is making the singular Bishop. So this idea of this universal direct authority, where you can sort of ordain anyone when you like, wherever you like, etc., and you have a one voice, is doing exactly what St. Gregory is condemning, because the point of the Bishop is the singular voice. It's a singular will that is the point of union, in the sense of the church. Of the thing is, it's on the round of consent, and it needs one voice, one mind, one will. And as soon as you add something else, you immediately deny him being bishop. And so I think that does that. Now the other point again was that yes, one Rome. If we can't have two churches, we can't have two heads, in a sense where you end up dividing a church into two. Now, this was a problem once Constantinople became New Rome, that it was liable to sort of split the church in East and Western churches. And sadly, in a sense, it did split that. But if you read the canons, Constantinople was always second after Rome. In other words, Rome was the type, and it still was thus the singular center of communion as such. And Constantinople was under that as well, was to defer to that. So even if it was equal, it still deferred to that. So the way Constantinople becomes the head now, it had all the same authorities and powers, but it's only able to take the first place totally now because there's no old Rome. But if old Rome comes back, it needs to come second after that. It needs to take a bow to the priority of old Rome. And so this is how I'd understand that jurisdiction. It's not, again, it's a distortion of authority, meaning I can tell you to do whatever I want, whenever you want, to an authority being you still need to respect my first place. You need to defer to that. You're not going into contradiction with the See of Rome just for the sake of contradiction. I mean, obviously you could stand up against it if you think it's going to the heresy, but otherwise you follow the way of Rome like everybody else. And I think that's important for the unity of churches. So that's how I would interpret.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess to sort of reiterate and summarize what you're saying with the example you have used about whether or not the priest will obey the bishop, his local bishop, or the Pope. Essentially, you're saying the Roman Catholic doctrine of immediate, direct, personal, and episcopal jurisdiction is what is, as defined by Vatican I, is what's crucially problematic. Is that fair?
Yes. It's not the first place. It's not the singularity in this sense, or an authority, or a universal scope of jurisdiction. It's when you start saying, I've got immediate jurisdiction as bishop in any diocese, and I can ordain anyone I want as a local bishop. That's where you've got a problem. It's not, and this is where it would be contrary to St. Gregory, what I'd say St. Gregory the Great, and St. Gregory the Great would have been opposed to this idea quite vehemently. No, I had no such authority, even if I saw a strong authority there. And I think sort of, again, Constantinople, since the loss of, has sort of exercised pretty much that singular thing. It talks about itself in the same sort of ways you see in the first millennium of Rome. It can be quite, we have a boss, all the rest of it. But it doesn't go and start doing these other things. I mean, in Ukraine, it acted, I think, uncanonically to certain ways, exerted its power. But then at the same time, I could argue, well, it can't go into schism. It's impossible for Constantinople to go into schism. It can go into heresy, but it can't go into schism because it's a centre of communion. If it's received you into communion and it recognises you, you're in communion with the church. And so I think this is where the sort of Eucharistic ecclesiology, without the hierarchical, without the status of Peter, without the centrality and the patriarchs and stuff, can become a problem. As then you sort of start, well, who are you to judge all the patriarch of Constantinople? Are you an ecumenical synod? Are you higher than that? Are you the one who's determining who isn't that of a? Suddenly you make yourself a pope to make that judgment, and this is suddenly see why you have to have this hierarchical structure in place. That only in heresy can you start trying to break off from it, and you can't talk about it going into schism as such. That's, you have to say it's taught heresy, even if it acted uncanonically badly. It's still what it is. It's just behaving badly.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Father. Well, I was about to say that the next section, it actually went into things we discussed in part one. So I was about to say it goes into theodic hierarchy, Dionysius the Areopagite, and St. Maximus the Confessor, building on him, and formal structural rules, the church canons. Actually, you know what? I don't know if we did talk about St. Maximus the Confessor.
Not where we talk about Dionysius the Areopagite. Yes, Maximus, I'm not using them a lot. I'm just using him to sort of build on and sort of expand a little bit on St. Dionysius's work. I've just sort of done it for completion without, he's not really adding an awful lot to it, but I thought it was just a useful way to expand on it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, building on Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, page 122 there. So, but yeah, honestly, I think that's really all I have. Questions I have for you, and give me a lot to think about and review. It's helpful too, as I'm reading these sources too, to talk about people that have dealt with them at a official academic level. So that's also very much appreciated. I'd love to have you back on to discuss another area of Orthodox theology. I actually have it saved. I started watching it, and then I started to fall asleep, but not because it was boring, but because I was exhausted from work. Your debate on the Filioque. I also look forward to watching I don't know if you had a discussion on Filioque with Eric Ybarra too, so I'm also looking forward to watching that, and everyone else go watch that too. And also your debates with Eric Ybarra, and that point you made too about primacy and the bishop, the priest choosing between the bishop and the pope. You mentioned that a few times in those two debates you did, so I was like, oh hey, it's a full circle. So I'll link those in the description, and also I'll link Amazon link for your book as well, and the link to part 1 interview on Orthodox perspective on primacy and ecclesiology. So, Father, is there anything else you would like to add or plug in for the viewers?
No. I'm pleased to have someone reading, engaging with it. So yeah, and I'm not very good at flying my own flags. Someone else wants to flag for me. That's cool.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much, Father, and thank you everyone else for watching. This has been episode 18, Orthodox Perspective on Primacy and Ecclesiology, Part 2, and my guest was Fr Monk Patrick. All right, everyone, thank you very much and have a blessed day.